Good morning students, and again welcome to our economics class. And last class we studied about investment function. We studied about the investment, what is investment, what are the different types of investment, autonomous investment and induced investment, what are their meaning, what are their differences, their diagram, etc. In today's class we study new topic, it is determination level of income and output in the economy. What we study, determination level of income and output in the economy means कि हम किसी भी इकोनॉमी के अंदर इनकम और आउटपुट लेवल कैसे डिसाइड करेंगे, which is the correct or equilibrium level of income and output in the economy. For it we have two methods to determine it. First is aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. The second is saving and investment approach. दो अप्रोच हमारे पास. पहला अप्रोच क्या है? Aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. Second is saving and investment approach. We earlier studied the meaning of aggregate demand, aggregate supply in details, their meaning, schedule, diagram, features, etc. and their types also. I repeat again. Aggregate demand means it's the total demand of goods and services in the economy by the different sector, and it is the sum of consumption demand and investment demand. Aggregate supply shows the total supply of goods and services which the producers like to supply in an economy at the given time period. In the condition of equilibrium, this aggregate demand and aggregate supply both are equal. Okay. In the aggregate demand, we include two components. These are consumption and investment. While in aggregate supply, we include consumption and saving. So at the time of equilibrium, aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. It means C plus I equal to C plus S. C plus I means, I repeat again, consumption and investment, and C plus S means consumption and saving. So in the case of equilibrium, investment are equal to saving in the economy. What is? If you take the C as common, in the condition of equilibrium, investment are equal to saving in the economy. So it is the second approach to determine the equilibrium level of income and output in the economy, investment and saving approach. So first we study about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach, and according to this approach, the economy is in equilibrium where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply both are equal. Now we see it with the help of the book. According to the book, after analyzing the concept of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, it's now easy for us to determine equilibrium level of national income and output in the economy. In this regard, there are two approaches, aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach, and second is saving and investment approach. First we see what is aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. In the Keynesian theory, the equilibrium level of income and output is determined mainly by the level of aggregate demand, it means C plus I. While estimating aggregate demand, we take only consumption demand and investment demand in the economy. The economy is in equilibrium where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal to each other, or aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve intersect each other. Now we see it with the help of a diagram. In the given diagram, we draw aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve, and we also study their different equilibrium conditions. In the diagram, x-axis we will take the income level or total output level in the economy on x-axis, while aggregate demand and aggregate supply on the y-axis. I repeat again, aggregate demand is the sum of consumption and investment demand, while aggregate supply is the sum of consumption and saving demand. AS is the aggregate supply curve in the economy, which is always equal to the income level in the economy and is determined the 45 degree angle. ये हमेशा 45 डिग्री का एंगल बनाएगा, it's compulsory. Second is aggregate demand, which is the sum of consumption and investment demand. It's earlier it's above the aggregate supply curve, then they are equal, and after it aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply in the economy. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve intersect each other at E point in the economy. कहाँ पर intersect कर रहे हैं? E point. It is the equilibrium point of the economy where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal to each other. At this point, total demand, aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the economy is EM, while income and output level in the economy OM. तो यहाँ पर क्या बता रहा है हमारे को, टोटल एग्रीगेट डिमांड कितना है इकोनॉमी के अंदर EM, और एग्रीगेट सप्लाई कितना है EM, और OM क्या है, इनकम और आउटपुट लेवल इन द इकोनॉमी. इट इज द इक्विलिब्रियम पॉइंट where aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. Okay, when income level is OM1 and this OM1, aggregate demand is D1M1, aggregate supply is S1M1. So their difference S1 D1 shows the excess aggregate supply in the economy. It means aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply in the economy. Aggregate supply ज़्यादा है, aggregate demand कम है. So S1 D1 is the excess aggregate supply in the economy. While when income level is OM2, aggregate demand in the economy D2M2, aggregate supply is S2M2. So their difference D2S2 is the excess aggregate demand in the economy. D2S2 क्या हमारे लिए excess aggregate demand in the economy. Aggregate demand level ज़्यादा है than the aggregate supply level in the economy, or it's D2S2. So I repeat again, in the economy, equilibrium point is E, where EM is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the economy, and it is the equilibrium point. While when income level is OM1, S1 D1 is the excess aggregate supply in the economy, or we can say that aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. When income level is OM2, as D2S2 is the excess aggregate demand in the economy, it means aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply in the economy. Now we see what happens if aggregate demand is more than the aggregate supply, or aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply. In the given diagram, D2S2 shows the excess aggregate demand in the economy. Aggregate demand ज्यादा है aggregate supply से. अब इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या होगा? अगर aggregate demand ज्यादा है तो क्या होगा? अगर हम किसी इकोनॉमी में गुड्स और सर्विसेज की डिमांड ज्यादा कर रहे हैं एज कंपैरिजन टू देयर एग्रीगेट सप्लाई, अगर डिमांड ज्यादा है सप्लाई कम है, तो इसका पहला इम्पैक्ट होता है इकोनॉमी के अंदर प्राइसेस इंक्रीज होंगे, और जब प्राइसेस बढ़ेंगे तो प्राइस बढ़ने पर क्या होगा, जो अगर प्राइस बढ़ने पर हम सप्लाई इंक्रीज नहीं कर पा रहे, ठीक है, तो सेलर ज्यादा प्राइस पर सेल करेंगे, तो उसका इंपैक्ट होगा कि इकोनॉमी के अंदर प्राइस लेवल इंक्रीज होगा, और प्राइस लेवल बढ़ने पर जो सेलर्स हैं उनका प्रॉफिट मार्जिन भी इंक्रीज होगा. When their profit margin increase, in that case they like to increase the supply of the commodity. वो क्या करेंगे, अपनी सप्लाई को इंक्रीज करने की कोशिश करेंगे, और जो सप्लाई इंक्रीज करेंगे they are demanding more and more factors of production in the economy. These are land, labor, capital, entrepreneur. जब फैक्टर्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की डिमांड ज्यादा होगी तो इकोनॉमी के अंदर फैक्टर इनकम इंक्रीज होगा इन द फॉर्म ऑफ रेंट, वेजेस, इंटरेस्ट एंड प्रॉफिट. जब फैक्टर इनकम इंक्रीज होगा इट मींस लोगों को ज्यादा एम्प्लॉयमेंट मिलेगा और इकोनॉमी के अंदर इनकम लेवल भी इंक्रीज होगा. एंड वी रीच द अगेन इक्विलिब्रियम लेवल ऑफ इनकम OM because of more demand in the economy than its supply. I repeat again, अगर एग्रीगेट डिमांड ज्यादा है एग्रीगेट सप्लाई से तो क्या होगा, सेलर्स ज्यादा क्वांटिटी में प्रोडक्शन करेंगे क्योंकि प्राइस बढ़ेगा, उनका प्रॉफिट इंक्रीज होगा. जब ज्यादा क्वांटिटी में प्रोडक्शन करेंगे तो फैक्टर्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की डिमांड भी ज्यादा होगी, और फैक्टर्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की डिमांड बढ़ने पर क्या होगा, लोगों को ज्यादा एम्प्लॉयमेंट मिलेगा, रेंट, इंटरेस्ट, एक्स्ट्रा जो फैक्टर इनकम है वो भी इंक्रीज होगी, और एज ए रिजल्ट इनकम लेवल विल आल्सो इंक्रीज इन द इकोनॉमी, एंड वी रीच द इक्विलिब्रियम पॉइंट वेयर इनकम एग्रीगेट डिमांड इज इक्वल टू एग्रीगेट सप्लाई. अब इसके अपोजिट, अगर मान लीजिए किसी इकोनॉमी के अंदर एग्रीगेट डिमांड कम है और एग्रीगेट सप्लाई ज्यादा है, जैसे कि इस डायग्राम में हमने बताया D1 S1 क्या शो कर रहा है हमारे को, एक्सेस एग्रीगेट सप्लाई इन द इकोनॉमी, और इसको कंट्रोल कर के लिए गवर्नमेंट क्या करेगी, एग्रीगेट सप्लाई ज्यादा है एग्रीगेट डिमांड कम है. पहले हम इस कंडीशन को समझते हैं. अगर एग्रीगेट डिमांड कम है और एग्रीगेट सप्लाई ज्यादा है तो शो कर रहा है कि किसी इकोनॉमी के अंदर जो अनडिजायर्ड स्टॉक है, जो अनसोल्ड स्टॉक है, उसकी क्वांटिटी बढ़ेगी. सिंपली हम बोल सकते हैं बिना बिका माल, क्योंकि हमने प्रोडक्शन तो कर दिया और उसकी डिमांड नहीं है, और उसकी वजह से क्या हो रहा है इकोनॉमी के अंदर एक्सेस सप्लाई की कंडीशंस इंक्रीज हो रही है। जब पहले का प्रोडक्शन सेलर्स का सेल आउट नहीं हो रहा तो नया प्रोडक्शन नहीं करेंगे, और जब नया प्रोडक्शन नहीं करेंगे तो ना तो फैक्टर्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की डिमांड होगी और ना ही इकोनॉमी के अंदर एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेट होगा। और जब एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेट नहीं हो रहा तो उसका इम्पैक्ट क्या होगा इकोनॉमी के अंदर, इनकम लेवल भी डिक्रीज होगा। एंड अगेन इट डिक्रीज फ्रॉम OM to OM in the economy where aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. So I repeat again, if in an economy there is excess aggregate demand, then aggregate supply, as a result of it demand increase, and due to increase in demand prices increase and profit margin of the seller will increase. They like to produce more and more goods and services. As a result of it demand of factors of production will increase. So employment opportunities or income level will also increase in the economy, and income level will increase from OM2 to OM where aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. On the other hand, if aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply, so unsold stock or inventories of the sellers will increase. They not like to increase their production, and as a result demand for the factors of production will also decrease in the economy, or with the decrease in demand for the factors of production employment opportunities will also decrease. It also reduce the income level in the economy, and income level decrease from OM1 to OM in the economy. So in the condition of equilibrium it's necessary that aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply in the economy. So in today's class we study about how we can determine equilibrium level of income and output in the economy. The first approach for it to determine is aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. We know the meaning of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. At the equilibrium point, aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. The components of aggregate demand are C plus I and aggregate supply C plus S. If we take the C as common, at that point investments are also equal to same. It is our second approach which we study in the next class. If aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, what will happen? If aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, what will happen? We study all these also with the help of the diagram. In the given diagram is the equilibrium point where income and output level in the economy OM and aggregate demand and aggregate supply EM. While D2S2 shows more aggregate demand in the economy than aggregate supply, and we also study what are its impacts. And S1 D1 shows when aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply and what are its impact in the economy. So in today's class we study all this in detail. In the next class we study second approach for the determination of income and output in the economy. It is saving and investment approach. In this approach we study what their equilibrium points. In the condition of equilibrium how saving and investments are equal, and what happens if saving is greater than investment or saving is less than investments. And the last we also use single approach of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply and saving and investment approach in the economy.